Yeah, so the book, which a lot of you have seen now, the last edition we did was 2003. I think the publishing date was 2004. Um, and in the meantime, we actually did, starting in maybe 2010, we started inserting updates to the book, which actually really helped in doing the new edition, because we kind of tracked along the way, sort of periodically, some of the changes. And but the first edition of the book was done in 1981, so it's been a long time, and it was actually predated by other handbooks that the organization Peacemakers and War Resisters League also took Peacemakers work and did some other sort of rough handbooks. And then in 1981, Ed Hedeman put together the first guide to war tax resistance and did another couple editions. And then I was on WRL staff in 87 to 2000. And the first edition I worked on was 1992. And then we did the 2003 edition together. So yeah, it's been a long history of the book. It's kind of a slow but steady seller. So we'll see what happens with this one. And the main reason I think, in putting out the book, of course, was to just help the network, all these individuals out there who were finding ways to resist and to help people keep in touch, and have the basic information in front of them about war tax resistance. So I'm going to go through some of the sort of technical kind of IRS-y changes first, and then some of them maybe more general trends. So this is called Changing Trends in War Tax Resistance. And they're kind of a little bit in chronological order, I think. But there's a lot of jumping around. But by 2005, actually, um, there were changes with the W-4. And so only in the last couple of years, we've had some other changes with the W-4 form, this confusing form that people who are salaried get and try to figure out, if they want to resist, how to change their allowance. Well, they used to be allowances, now they're deductions in order to resist. But actually in 2005, one of the big changes at that time was that employers used to have to send in the form if somebody was taking a high amount of deductions. They had to report it to the IRS. And the IRS stopped that and started tracking better. So by 2005, their computers were getting better, and they started tracking better people's reported income to what they actually filed. So after a couple of years, it was easier for the IRS to figure out if somebody's W-4 was set at the wrong amount and not having enough withholding. So that kind of changed things a little bit. And the IRS started sending something called a lock-in letter to the employer if they figured out that this individual didn't have enough withholding on their form. So that kind of took the employer a little bit out of the whole W-4 resistance thing, and focused more on computers and tracking. And it also, at that time, because our computers were getting better, made it harder to be a non-filer. And so there are a lot of people who had been non-filers, Vietnam era or longer and on. But if they started having some reported income, it was a little more difficult to keep that information from the IRS because they were doing better at matching the W-2s and the 1099s that were sent in for people. So, their computers are still problematic, but they did start improving that whole system around 2005. And on from that, I guess, in terms of this issue of non-filing with the Affordable Care Act or with the federal student loans, the FAFSA form, they're drawing more people into the system. You have to say if you filed, and they do a certain amount of spot checking and tracking on that. So it's a little bit harder for people to be non-filers if they want health care through the Affordable Care Act or applying for student loans, federal student loans, stuff like that. So over the years, I think more non-filers, longtime non-filers started getting caught. And so that was one of the kind of trends as far as being in the office or being a counselor, was responding to this issue of non-filers who suddenly were hearing from the IRS, who hadn't heard from them a long time. One of the other issues that I don't talk about too much now, but there was a little blip at one point in also about 2005 around nonprofits, 501c3s. And I think it's always been kind of one of those questions in the war tax resistance movement when we were there's more talk of organizational resistance and organizations supporting resistors. And these nonprofits with 501c3 tend to be really afraid of supporting a resistor. There was a church out in California that after the invasion of Iraq, the minister out there had given a speech against the invasion of Iraq and the war on terror. And the IRS went after that church. And so that kind of brought up some of this question about 501c3 and groups being afraid. And we did some publicity, particularly with Catholic Worker, which has a policy of not having an official nonprofit status. And it's the same with War Resisters League and National War Tax Resistance, which stay out of that whole system in order to do what we do without fear, really. And so that kind of there's been some information about that here and there. One of the big changes for the book itself was there was a lot of information on the telephone tax in all the other editions of the book until 2006. And in 2006, that was the point where this excise tax that had been on telephone calls for years, decades, since the late 1800s, on and off during wars, they would take this tax on and off. If there was a war, they put it back on. And then finally in the Vietnam War, they kept this tax on telephone calls. It had been steady since then. But once there were cell phones and more of this, bundled services, that's what it's called, bundled services, so that they couldn't track the long distance calls and taxes, and some big corporations sued the IRS. It took about 7 lawsuits, but the IRS finally lost in 2006. So the only telephone tax now is on local landline service. So it's pretty limited. So that was a big change. A whole huge section of the book kind of got put into the history. And there's a smaller amount now on telephone tax. And we still have the brochure, I guess, but it's not something we really push anymore. So that was a big change. Also in 2006 and into 2009, the IRS was told by Congress to hire private collection agencies to go after people with tax debt. And this was kind of a big fight about whether it was cost efficient or not. And the IRS was against it. And by 2009, it was finally figured out that it actually wasn't cost efficient for them to hire these private collection agencies to try to collect. So they dropped that, but then they put it back on in 2017. So now there's still, some of you have heard from private collection agencies. They don't have too much power, but it still exists, and it's, if they hired more IRS staff, they could just do the job. But instead they contract out because there are a few contractors who lobby their congresspeople to get these contracts from the federal government. And I should say that a lot of these things that I'm skimming over, you can also talk about more in the upcoming 101 and 201, 202, whatever they are, the next 2 sessions after this, if you have questions about them. The frivolous penalty is another one of the things that has made some difference in counseling and our actions over the years. In the early 80s, I guess, the IRS instituted this frivolous penalty so that they were trying to control people from writing messages on their forms and, all kinds of things, sending in blank forms. And it wasn't actually just for war tax resistors. There are all kinds of people out there who think the income tax is illegal. And so there was all kinds of, stuff that the IRS would be getting about, I'm not paying the tax for this reason or that, or, something or another. So they instituted this frivolous penalty back in the 80s. But in 2007, it went to $5,000 from $500. So that was kind of a shock to everyone. And they also started, they created an office for the frivolous penalty out in Utah and started blasting out a lot of letters. A lot of war tax resistors got these letters, not that they'd done anything wrong filling out their form, but often they just enclosed a letter saying why they weren't paying. And that wasn't part of the rules for frivolous penalties. But the IRS, partly incompetence, whatever, it wasn't necessarily because they were going after war tax resistors. It's just that this office was busy sending out their letters. And the one success in our movement after some years, so that started in 2007, and lots of frivolous letters to people over time. Some got the penalty, some didn't. But one of our big successes is, I don't know, sometime maybe around 2011, we contacted the Taxpayer Advocate's Office, and they had a section about systemic violations or something like that, and said, people who are just sending a letter with their form that they've filled out normally should not get the frivolous penalty. This is a free speech thing. You should be able to send a letter to the IRS and tell them what you're doing. So it took about 2 years, but they finally did have their legal office issue a letter that it was okay for people to send a letter with their form. And we actually had a few war tax resistors who'd been charged the $5,000 who got their money back from the IRS with interest. So yeah, that was one of our biggest successes over time. But they still have the frivolous penalty, of course, and you do have to be careful about writing stuff on your form. They have about 40 different categories of frivolous. A lot of them have to do with the people who are no tax people. A lot of them are right wing or whatever, libertarian kinds of protests about taxes. But there are a couple that apply to conscientious objection and refusing to pay for the military. Professional licensing, there have been some people who've been worried about that over the years. And in 2008, dentist Tom Wilson in Western Massachusetts had to close his dental practice, which he'd kept going for many years despite his war tax resistance. And he refused to pay both state and federal taxes. And it was actually the state taxes that was the reason they went after his professional license. But it's still kind of an issue out there for people to be aware of. Oh boy, the growth over the years, I think especially with online filing and more of the, you can have an account with the IRS online, more of the, and just email and all of that, the scams that we all get notices about. The IRS, wants to talk to you. You get all these emails and other stuff. So dealing with a lot of those scam things from other people who are pretending to be the IRS has been a huge problem for the IRS. And also to some extent in our counseling, I think over the years, people get some notice and get very frightened by, oh my God, they say to contact them. And often it is not the IRS. It's usually one of these private companies that, if you went to their office, it would be empty. There'd be no one at that address. But they have managed over the years to get a lot of money from taxpayers in the US. And I don't know how many war tax resistors have ever been caught up in it, but you have to be pretty careful and make sure about the letters that you're getting that they're really from the IRS. So they don't send emails, to collect, or usually they don't call first, they just send letters. So. Usually there are typos in the letters. Yeah, they often have a real fakey kind of logo on them. Or yeah, sometimes they send these big postcards. I don't know what else, but they do sort of stand out. And if you were really afraid, you can actually call the IRS and ask them, is this your letter? But often if you try to call one of those numbers, you'll find out it's somebody trying to help you settle your debt with the IRS. I think I have talked to a few of them now and then you tell them, but I'm refusing to pay because of war. And they're like, huh? So yeah, if you actually talk to them, you can usually tell what's going on. Let's see, there a lot of the libertarian conservative groups who've been very active around coming up with reasons, they're honestly, a lot of them scams about telling people they don't have to pay taxes and offering ways that often they sell a package or a book or something that tells you how to like file and get a big refund. The IRS has lost millions of dollars this way from people using one of these sort of trick things to get a refund from the IRS, or to fill out their form in a way that they are taking a bunch of credits. And that's been a big problem for the IRS, and kind of confusing in our network at times. There was a film that came out in 2007 or 9, around there, called America Freedom to Fascism, which talked about how the income tax is illegal. And that it got a lot of people interested in it, and it kind of intersects with our network now and then, gets a little confusing about anti-tax versus specific reasons of conscience for not paying, whether it's war or many of the other issues now. And the IRS had an office, it was called Abusive Tax Avoidance Transactions, or ATAT. And they actually looked at Newtrick at one point. In 2009, they were kind of looking at me and also at Newtrick at that time. And one of the things that saves our network really is that we don't charge for anything. We do sell books, but we don't charge for counseling. We don't. A lot of these other groups that the IRS really went after and shut down, and some of their lawyers have spent decades in jail. It's actually pretty horrific, some of the penalties that they've gotten. But in our network, we've been lucky about this sort of non-directive counseling. We don't help people fill out their tax forms. We don't tell them what to do. We just give the options. And that's been really important, I think, in protecting us from some of these things. But of course, some of that anti-income tax and income tax is illegal led to the Tea Party actions in 2009, which were pretty huge demonstrations. And for a year or two, the Tea Party was really active. And they were friendly sometimes to war tax resistance. Some of us had conversations or did protests with some of the Tea Party people, but also they're very anti-tax, and a lot of them got into Congress. And so that kind of led to the IRS losing a lot of money over the years. So the IRS has, certainly in recent years, been less active because of the budget cuts that they've received. And a lot of the Tea Party people are still in Congress. So, and there's one sort of in the White House. So we're not sure what it's going to look like for a while now. In 2010, also Congress passed the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act. And for some years in the War Tax Resistance Network, we'd tell people, get a bank in Canada, get a bank outside the US. It's harder for the IRS to find, but this act in 2010 made it much more difficult to hide your money in another country. It just made it easier. A lot of the banks had to report to the IRS in the US about any American citizens who had accounts there. So that changed. And in 2015, the highway bill included a thing about passports, that at that time in 2015, if you had a tax debt of $50,000 or more, that your passport could be in question. It might not be renewed. And that's still in effect. And now it goes up every year. Is it 65,000 now? Something like 64,000. And it's going up based on the interest rate or something. But so the passport issue is one we've had to talk about in a way that we didn't used to. And then a few more general things, I guess. The international network, Newtrick, has been connected for a long time with an international network on war tax resistance and peace tax campaigns, and is still part of that network, but the network itself has gotten weaker. Uh-oh, no Black Jetta in the room. Correct. Oh. A little break here for a car announcement. Yeah, no problem. What year was it? In 2004, actually, there was a group in England called the Peace Tax 7, which began a series of legal challenges. In Britain, some of them had been collected on for their refusal in the United Kingdom, their tax refusal. And so most of them had a long series of run-ins with inland revenue in the UK. But they took a case to the European Convention on Human Rights, hoping to get a case, present a case on conscientious objection to paying for the military. And it was a pretty big campaign. There's a little film about them. They still have a website. I think it's probably peacetax7.org or something. It's a pretty good story. They didn't, of course, get anywhere with their case that they were presenting. But that was one of the maybe bigger things that happened in the international network. It used to be pretty diverse. There's not so much now. Spain is probably one of the most active countries, or country with the most active war tax resistance. Although even there, they've had so many crackdowns that I think they're doing like a €1 campaign now or something like that, because so many of their people have been collected on, but they're still very active, especially in the Basque Country, actually. Canada has a group, Germany, Italy has some more tax resistance, and in the UK, Conscience is still very active. And I think Conscience has a lot of information on civil resistance and nonviolent defense. They're a group that does a lot of work with that. They had their peace tax fund was to take the resisted tax money and create a department for nonviolent resistance, for nonviolent defense, which was a really good connection in England. UK, yeah. So we still have anyway contact, and some of the international people join our meetings at times. So there's still a little bit of involvement there. And so, as I said, there have been many fewer IRS collections in recent years, especially COVID and post-COVID, because the IRS, the lockdown really put them way behind. And then with their cuts in staff and even more cuts now, they do still send out a lot of letters, as many of us know, but the number of levies and collections of any sort has been practically nil for a few years. So in the book, we have a whole section there on personal stories. A lot of them are people who aren't with us anymore, but have these amazing stories of their resistance. And the reason we maintained a lot of those stories is partly because they were people who really had spent time in jail, had major collections from the IRS, or really had the IRS after them for years, but they kept resisting. And they're just, most of them, really inspirational stories. So we just added a couple this year. Julia Butterfly Hill is one. She was the climate activist who sat in the tree out in Oregon for months and months. And she did a big resistance, $175,000 in 2003 in protest of the Iraq invasion. And so her story's in there. The IRS attempted, but got nowhere with collecting from her over the years. And Tony Serra, we have him in the book. I'm not sure he's in that chapter, but a few people did spend time in jail, and Tony Serra was one of them. From 2005 to 2013 was the last person who related to our network at all who spent some time in jail. There was a religious community in New Jersey, the Restored Israel of Yahweh, and they ran a contracting business and didn't withhold from it was a pacifist community, and some of their people didn't want withholding. So the owners and their secretary, actually a treasurer, spent at least a year, more than a year, some of them 2, I guess, in prison as employers not withholding from people. And then Tony Serra, who's a lawyer out in California, an anarchist lawyer, has had a big practice over the years. He is one of the few people who actually was jailed for refusing to pay. That's a really rare charge. for actual refusing to pay income taxes. He seemed to enjoy his time in prison because he, as a lawyer, was very helpful to the other prisoners. He'd set up a little table in the yard and give them legal advice. Um, a couple other people, Frank Donnelly and Carlos Stewart, both spent almost a year in prison in 2009-10. And they were people who kind of found our network after the fact, after the IRS really went after them, both of whom had done some shaky things on their tax forms or not reported income and got tax evasion charges, which we in our counseling definitely try to help people avoid that kind of charge. And Quaker Joseph Olajak from upstate New York spent, I don't know, many weekends in the county jail. And he had also done some kind of slippery thing of hiding assets that the IRS caught up with. And so all those people found our network, those three found our network after, and actually restored Israel too, after the IRS really went after them. So going to jail is really, really uncommon, and you have to do something pretty bad. There have been a few other people who've taken cases to court voluntarily. Dan Jenkins in 2005 tried the Ninth Amendment argument in New York, and Elizabeth Boardman out in California tried an argument about the frivolous penalty, that being a conscientious objector, she shouldn't get a frivolous penalty. And Bill Ruhock has taken a case or two also to try to argue on conscience in the courts. None of them have gone very far. The courts reject them every time, and you can be charged with a frivolous penalty for going to court. But so nobody's gone recently. Just one more thing, I guess, the Hobby Lobby case, which came up in 2014 around the Affordable Care Act, is a company that has, the owners are religious and they didn't want to have to give health care, give contraceptive, yes, healthcare. And they took their case, I think it went to the Supreme, they did go to the Supreme Court, and they won. They got an what do you call it? Allowance not to offer this. And so our legal advisor, Peter Goldberger in Philadelphia, has always hoped that we could use the Hobby Lobby case as an argument for refusal to pay military taxes. But in order to do that, you have to have the IRS go after you first, and you have to have the IRS take you to court. And because they're not going after anybody these days, we're kind of stuck. You can't just sue the IRS. They have to come after you first. So we still have the Hobby Lobby case out there as one that could be used someday if anybody ever gets really charged heavily by the IRS. So, I guess the other thing, just to lead into maybe what Christina is going to talk about, is politically, of course, war tax resistance, from my point of view, rises and falls with the peace movement and the wars, and when there's a war, people get like, oh my God, my taxes. And then that kind of, 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, a lot of attention to war tax resistance. And then that kind of died down. And so and actually Occupy Wall Street, I think, brought some good attention again to taxes. And actually, one thing I wanted to mention about Occupy Wall Street is I think that they put the whole mutual aid kind of effort more in front of us. And a lot of people did a lot of mutual aid coming out of Occupy Wall Street. And so just thinking about Virginia's talk and a skill that war tax resistors have, or in terms of redirection, this idea of mutual aid is one that we could use more. We did a war tax boycott in 2007 with the invasion of Iraq and Hurricane Katrina, encouraged people to redirect to victims in Iraq through a particular organization, and also in New Orleans for Katrina. And that campaign was pretty good. That got a pretty good amount of attention in terms of redirection, and a few $1,000s got redirected that way. Obama's presidency, yeah, the peace president. So, uh, with his Nobel Prize. Things weren't too active during that time, unfortunately. But with the election of Trump, there was another surge, in 2016 of people who were like, I don't want to pay for what this guy is doing. So there were the tax protests because he didn't want to show his taxes. So there were some big protests at that time and some more interest in tax resistance and more tax resistance in general. Um, and yeah, around those marches. And so now we're in this new era, aside for Gaza and the Biden administration and the Democrats and their support of the genocide in Gaza. Now we have Trump again and all of this. So yeah, so obviously a whole new surge in war tax resistance. So I think well, the one other thing I wanted to mention is, I guess, the changes in technology. And of course, when I started at Nutric as a coordinator in 2003, we had kind of a rudimentary website that was part of the wider nonviolence web at the time. But the technology has changed. At some point, we got enough money to hire somebody to do social media for us in the after 2010 sometime. So yeah, that's made a big difference. And with the book, we did the print version, but we also have an ebook version. I have a little flyer there that has the information about ordering it as an ebook. So I expect this might be the last print edition of this book. And it did come out at a moment when things are changing with the more people getting fired from the IRS. So yeah, that's why we have, I did put some printed updates with the books out there. If you bought a book now, you could pick up one of those printed ones, but there's also a QR code to go to the latest updates, which we will keep updating as things change, and we'll see where things go now. And yes,